Louise, chip in as and when you want to, and just to say that we are recording this as a useful training tool for other people as we talk about oral history. So with that, John, thank you very much for making the time to join us and lead the session.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin. I think the way we're planning to do this is I'm going to talk about some of the sort of techniques of doing it, just ignoring the problems. And then in the second half, we'll have a discussion about what we actually can do under these circumstances and how we can make the arrangements. And that's what Louise has sent you some attachments which we'll deal with then. But the first part of the session this evening, and it ignores the current problems and all the technical issues, and it looks at the why and how of collecting oral history evidence. Don't bother to take any notes, or I'm sure you weren't anyway, because what I'm talking to tonight is as a kind of handout which I'll send you afterwards. I'll send you as an email afterwards with all the information, including some web links that I'm going to talk about in a second. In fact, we'll talk about that now. The Oral History Society in Britain is long established. I think it goes back to 1971. It's connected with the British Library, and also with something that the British Library runs called National Life Stories. The website, the Oral History Society, has got loads of information, and the most useful section for what I'm dealing with is found under their advice pages. But I'll send you around an attachment with a link to that, to the National Life Stories, and to some others that I'm going to mention. In fact, I think even better than the OHS site is an older American site called Do History. This is a big local history site, but it has one of its sections has a step-by-step guide to oral history, which is written in the 90s, but so it's no good for the technology aspects of the subject, but the principles of good interviewing haven't really changed, and it seems the best summary. So I intend to work through its section called How Do I Ask the Questions, and I'll include that on the handout with my comments as we go along. Does that make some sort of sense? It sounds as though I'm cheating a bit, but it's probably the easiest way to do it. There are two other aspects before I get onto that you might like to follow up after this evening. Exactly a week from now, on the 18th of November, which is next Wednesday at 6:15, so exactly a week from now, the Athelstan Museum will be running an online lecture by Bill Reed about Malmesbury Voices and Oral History Collection. And that's an award-winning project which is based at the Athelstan Museum. I'll give you the link, so if you want to sign up to listen to that lecture. And of course, there's also a number of websites that you can explore which are based on or describing oral history projects, and I'm going to include links for you on some West Country ones. There's one called Harvest Stories, which is from West Dorset and East Devon, around Bridport Way. There's another one called Somerset Voices, and there's an Exmoor Oral History Archive. So these are all things you can explore. And also that Malmesbury project I just mentioned, although you can listen to the whole thing in the museum if you can get into it when it reopens, but there are some clips online, which I'll give you the link. But if we have when I finish talking, perhaps I could just play you 2 or 3 minutes from those clips, just as kind of light relief. So what I'd like to do is talk for just a couple of minutes about why oral history, where its place, and then I'd like to go through a sort of practical side of asking the questions. Is that okay? The why of it all, because when it got started in the 70s, most historians, or a lot of historians, looked down their nose at it and said, well, you know, it's not proper history. The information you're getting, we can't use that as a reliable historical source. And the man who set up the Oral History Society was called Paul Thompson, and he published a book. He wrote a book, which I got here, called The Voice of the Past. They come out backwards, don't they, when you're doing your Zoom? But The Voice of the Past, Paul Thompson. This is actually the first edition, 1978, but it's gone on and on and on, and you can buy a new one for the 2017 edition, which is twice as fat as that one. But right back at the beginning, he went to great lengths to try and justify the validity of oral history. You see, like all historical sources, the results you collect through oral history are fallible, because of course people's memories are fallible. They're open to bias and misunderstanding. And of course, they may tell you anecdotes that they've told many times before, and they've improved in the telling. You know how it is. Of course, they may gloss over things. They don't want to be known, and they may have trouble expressing themselves. They might struggle to find the right word. And then it might be difficult to convert their words to paper, to transcribe them, because of course, like I'm doing now, we're not talking necessarily in sentences. The written word is different from the spoken word. But of course, many of those criticisms can also be levelled at the proper written, as it were, written and documentary sources as well. For example, we historians will use what we call blue books, the government papers of the 19th century, the royal commissions, but quite a lot of those are what they call minutes of evidence, and what they're doing there is interviewing people and then writing down what they say. And going further back, a class of documents, very good one to use, called settlement examinations, which is when they try to establish whether somebody has a legal settlement in a parish. The examination is an interview, and this is true a number of sources that we use. And of course, also, and Paul Thompson makes this point, when you're actually dealing with an interviewee, you have got a real person there that you can go back and ask them more questions. If you're looking at a 19th century source, well, you've got to take it on trust that, for example, a newspaper account, that the journalist got it right and he didn't just stay in his bedroom and make it up. And you've got no recourse to go back and check, if you like, and so you can't actually interrogate people who are now dead from the past. Whereas oral history is more lively in that sense. You can actually find out more and keep expanding it. But we need to be aware, I think, that to make any oral history that we collect a good, solid, sound historical source, that the way we do it, we're not introducing bias or omissions or inaccuracies. Oral history is good for some aspects of history. It's not so good for others. I'll stop at that point, because that you could want to challenge that or think it through a bit more. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes,
Okay.
I think it does, John.
Okay, all right. Well, so we're dealing with something that's a recognizable source of information. Louise will be able to put footnotes, personal communication, or if we've got this sort of tabulated, she'll be able to cite it as a source. That's the why. But of course, Louise and any historian, the key thing with history is to evaluate your sources. So to evaluate the evidence and use it or reject it accordingly. So we may get an interview from somebody and then we decide, well, actually, he didn't know what he was talking about, or he got confused. So you evaluate your sources, you always do. But that's a bit about the why. Well, moving on to the how. And so what I've done in front of me here, I've got I think it's 13 topics that this American website has listed under how do I ask the questions. And I've annotated it for what I want to tell you. Well, the first requirement, in general, have a list of topics in mind, not specific questions word for word and not a specific sequence. But you may want to have a startup list of questions to get your interviewer and yourself comfortable. before you change to your topic list. Now, Louise has given us a list of topics, and it's based on the one that was used years and years ago. And some of them are a bit out of date now, but many of them, the topic list is fine. But before you get on to dealing with the topics, then you start with the basic, and I think you really need to start with, this is an interview of Joe Bloggs by John Chandler, made on 1st of December 2020 at his house in Bremhill, something like that, just to get it sort of sorted, what you're actually doing. We'll talk later about whether at this stage you also need his or her to say, yes, I agree to you, using the material that I'm going to tell you. Whether we do that at the end, but somewhere it needs to be on the recording. And of course, we'll probably then ask a little bit about their date of birth, for example. If it's a lady, whether is that your maiden name, where were you born, little questions like that, general details. But at this stage, you're not asking difficult topical questions. So these will overlap a little bit. The next point that the American site says, do plan the topic and form of your first substantial question after the settling down phase. Ask a question that will prompt a long answer and get the subject going. So you see, you're trying to, with a bit of general chat, you're trying to put the person at ease, the subject at ease, before you start tackling the subjects on your list. And then the third one is similar. Ask easy questions first, such as brief biographical queries. Ask very personal or emotionally demanding questions after you've developed the rapport. And then end as you begin, sort of lower it again at the end, not with bombshells, but gently with lighter questions, sort of chit chat again. And this will come up later as well. Try not to ask leading questions, by which, properly a leading question is when you phrase a question in such a way that you sort of expect or encourage a particular answer. So don't try and bias the person inadvertently by the way you phrase the questions. So, for example, if you're talking about going to Sunday school, don't say those Sunday school outings must have been a lot of fun. But you should say, well, what was it like to go on Sunday school outings? And then you'll find out whether it was fun or whether it wasn't fun. You don't want them to give you the answer that they think you want to hear, if you see what I mean. Obviously, ask questions one at a time. They say, well, you've got a rough list of subjects, so try to explore them one at a time, tick them off one at a time without darting about all over the place. Because for one thing, it'll make it easier when you're sort of indexing and summarizing what the interview was about. But obviously, don't stop a subject. If they get going on something which you're going to talk about later, well, okay, don't interrupt. And similarly, and this is very important, it says, allow silence to work for you. Wait. It's not like the Today programme when the interviewers are always trying to get back in before they've finished. Silence is all important because, as you'll know, if somebody appears to have finished but you don't think they really have, don't ask another question, and they'll probably start again and tell you something else. And then be a good listener using body language such as looking at the interviewee, nodding and smiling to encourage and give the message, yes, I am interested. So don't interrupt or talk over the subject. And if you do accidentally, apologize. And this is true, certainly if you work on television or anything, nod rather than giving verbal agreement. You know what a noddy shot is on a television interview. You see, if you start saying yes all the time, and it'll come on the recording, it's very annoying. Do you remember in Fawlty Towers, there's a bit where Sybil is on the phone and she keeps saying, oh, I know, oh, I know, oh, I know. And Basil gets really sort of irritated. But you can see why it's much better just to nod, and then it doesn't come over on the recording. And then the next instruction is similar. If necessary, use verbal encouragement such as, this is wonderful information, or how interesting, but don't keep saying aha when the interviewee is speaking. And then, so we've dealt with that. And then ask for specific examples if the interviewee makes a general statement and you need to know more. Or you might say, I don't understand. Could you explain in more detail? So if they just say, oh yeah, it was very hard in the 1930s or something, you don't want that. You want for examples, specific. What do you mean? You know, what when you say, you know, life was good here or there, just dig down and get examples. But I think, and it doesn't really come over in these instructions, shy away from questions like, what year did the post office burn down? That sort of question, because people tend to telescope and confuse events. So mix things up, or they'll put two things together. And anyway, with something like that, when did the post office burn down? I'm sure it didn't, but that sort of question, you can find that out reliably by other means. I think oral history is at its best when it's picking up attitudes and ways of life, ways of doing things, everyday activities at work and home. It's not so good at the sort of factual events like that, when something happened. And then another thing, ask for definitions and explanations of words that the interviewee uses and have critical meaning for the interviewee, for the interview. Ideally, if you're interviewing, for example, a farm labourer or a tractor driver or something from the 1950s, do a bit of homework so you actually know what questions to ask, but then play dumb and pretend you don't understand what they're talking about, because then they'll have to explain it all. Nothing worse than having two old boys in the pub talking to each other, but they both know all the you know, they've shared experiences, so they don't actually explain what they mean by what they're saying. Rephrase and re-ask an important question several times if you must, fair enough. And this is important, try to phrase your questions so that they don't have a simple yes or no answer, because what you want is, and the example they give here is, were you a farmer on Denny Hill during the 1930s? Well, if you ask that, the answer is yes or no. But if you say, what was it like farming up on Denny Hill during the 1930s? Then you get what they call an essay question and an essay answer. And finding out not just what they did, but what they thought about and what they felt about it. Ask follow-up questions and then ask some more. Well, yes, but there is a distinction to be made, I think, but be a bit wary of asking about times before the subject was born, and which they could only have by hearsay. They could only heard from older relatives or friends, because then you've got no way of testing that reliability. Don't stop the subject, but realize that information is going to be of lower quality. In preparation for this, I interviewed a friend's mother who has dementia. She's actually not much older than me, but she told me all about she was brought up in the West Midlands, and she said when the bombing was on Coventry, she could see the sky lit up in the distance over Coventry. And I knew that she'd been born in 1943, and I looked up to see when the bombing ended in Coventry, and it was in 1942. So she had a vivid memory of this, but it must be secondhand from what she was told by her mother. Because I wasn't doing this properly. I then queried it with her, but she was insistent that she'd seen all this. And so, you know, I knew that wasn't very reliable information. And then the last thing on this checklist is be flexible. Watch for and pick up on promising topics, even if they're not topics on your interview guide sheet. And again, years ago, I interviewed a lady called Kathleen Wiltshire, who was a folklorist in Wiltshire, an elderly lady. And quite unprompted, she told me that one of her lived in the same village, a lady called Jean Morrison, who older people in Wiltshire will know, the historian of Bratton. And Kathleen Wiltshire told me, well, did you know that Jean is a witch, a white witch? And of course I did know that, and everybody knew that, but it was nice to have it on tape. And then of course she said, well, perhaps I shouldn't have told you that. but there you go. Well, that's run down my list of questions. Can I just now give you just a couple of examples? I did use this technique. I've used it intermittently. I'm not an expert by any means, but I did use it. I have used it intermittently. And when I was doing a book on the Vale of Pewsey some years ago, I interviewed a couple in the village of Easton Royal, and I used the conversation to sort of frame a chapter I wanted to write about folklore. And we touched on various things, and I kept sort of talking to them, and then in the chapter I then used other similar sort of material and then came back to them. But here's just a passage from the book I wrote. It's Hilda and Alec, the elderly couple, and they lived at Easton Royal. At Easton, Hilda remembered that the electricity came when she was 16, which would be about 1931. We had 3 lights and a plug. That was what they put in for nothing. And do you know, Alec added, that up until the electric light came, everybody had oil lamps. Nobody had a big lamp. And of course, the electric light now is on the ceiling, but the oil lamp was on the table. So it was lower in the room. You could walk down to the village and hardly notice that there were lights anywhere. Now that's a little sort of touch that, you wouldn't find in a history book, and it's not something that you'd think of. The other thing I'd like to do, just as light relief for a couple of minutes, can I just try and play you these little bits of Malmesbury clips just for a minute? And then we'll move on to the business side of whether we can actually do any of this under the present circumstances. So let me just get this going. There are 3 clips. I think that you'll be able to hear them. I'm using a tablet, which is on full volume now. One is about a horse-drawn fire engine. See if this works.
1926, I think it must have been.
Can you hear it?
When I was living in Bristol Street. One day, the Malmesbury fire engine came galloping down Bristol Street through towards Higham, where they had ricks on fire. The fire engine was pulled by horses and quite a sight. Some boys and my friends, we followed it and got up to Higham. They were getting the water from the river, the long hose. The hose had holes in it, and water jets were coming out of it. My friends all had fun with the water spraying out. Not very successful, really, the fire engine, but rather dilapidated then.
And this one's about tanks during the war.
Lady Suffolk allowed my mother to take us children through Tottenham Park for a walk on a Sunday afternoon. And so we used to see all the soldiers there. And I remember when they were on manoeuvres, or practicing for manoeuvres, I suppose it was, when I lived at Avon Lodge, they used to be on the road going up and up Blix Hill and up round there in the dead of night. And they were all there, tanks and everything. And if the tanks broke down, they were just shoved in a yard. There was one in the Duke of York yard for ages because there was no one else to do with it. And we had to be so careful going to work in case these tanks were coming up or down Holloway Hill. And you had to get out of the way quick or else you would be knocked over by them.
And this last one's more recent, I think, probably from the 1970s or 80s, I suppose.
This was when there was bustards had been reintroduced onto Salisbury Plain, the Wiltshire bird, and I thought, well, the Wiltshire birds are back, let's make some bustards.
This is for the carnival.
I know several bustards who were quite happy to come in along, play city buggers with me. So I can't remember exactly how many, but there were 8 or 9, including Daniel McAlevey in a wheelchair. He appeared and was pushed all the way around with his brilliant parents. And we had one that somehow or other I got it fitted on the bloody rucksack backwards. So we all had labels. And I just said he was a backward bastard. One of them I painted yellow, and we had a notice on the back saying that he was sponsored by Coleman's Mustard. We did have great fun with our bustards.
Yeah. So a great bastard in a wheelchair. Right, that was really what I wanted to sort of convey, and I'll put all that on this handout and email it round to you. Now, the next stage really is, I don't know whether you want to say anything, Louise, or...
Yeah, sure. John, thanks for that really great introduction to the techniques of interviewing. That was really interesting. So I just want to make my contribution. I hope that some of you or all of you have had a chance to go over the information which I sent out last night, and apologies for the typos. I just want to go over a few points and then go over the challenges, and I hope to get some discussion going on these, because I really would appreciate some sort of input from you. So as far as I'm concerned, oral history is the recording and preservation and analysis of historical information based on experiences and opinions. Now, I think it's really important because it gives voice to individuals and groups who are often marginalized in conventional histories, you know, like women and ethnic minorities particularly. And I think it can provide new information and alternative explanations and different kinds of insights, which I think could be enormously valuable to the project. And I think we've worked really hard thus far to uncover stories from Bremhill's past, but what we've not done is engaged with a resource that we have in the community, i.e. its people. And it has been an objective of the project to carry out oral history interviews from the beginning, although the intention was that we would collaborate with local schools. I think the pandemic makes this difficult or probably impossible. And although it's recommended that interviews are conducted in person, and this recommendation comes from the Oral History Society, because it helps facilitate the natural rapport and flow of conversation, which John has alluded to and how important that is. I think as we are currently in a lockdown, and despite the fact that the Society recommends postponing conducting interviews until after the pandemic, I think if we can address the challenges, we can still keep to our deadlines and deliver on our objectives and get some really good perspectives from the community. So the first challenge is that obviously face-to-face interviews are impossible. And I think even when the current lockdown restrictions are removed, I think with the necessity to do the social distancing, I think that there will be a continued necessity to have interviews done remotely. So given the stress created by the pandemic, I suggested within the document that I think that interviews should be conducted with those to whom we are already known. So the interviewer should have some relationship already with a participant. Another problem is raised by the method through which interviews are made and recorded. And I put a few options on the handout, but I wondered if I could ask people their thoughts about conducting these interviews on Zoom. I realize that it has some problems, but obviously we've been using it successfully, and a basic account provides a face-to-face video conferencing and an audio only option that can be unobtrusively recorded. So, I mean, what did people think of that?
Let's open it up for discussion and see what people think. John Harris is waving his hand. If he turns on his mic, we might be able to hear his pearls of wisdom.
Hello, Martin.
Hi, John.
I wrote down some likely candidates who are fairly elderly. Brian Pocock, the farmer, Nicol Jordan, who's over 80, who's the Burwood vet, Tamsin Castle, who's 93, Mark Kite, whose father was the verger, and Jean Webb, farmer, elderly farmer, my next door neighbour.
Brilliant.
And none of them have access to Zoom anyway. That's the problem.
Yeah.
I don't see it so much of a problem in terms of social distancing. I mean, 6 feet with the interviewer masked. A recording on, I mean, I did a recording on a video camera without the video on, which actually was reasonably successful. But I don't think the sort of people that have got the knowledge and the history of the area and the interesting stories are going to be available to go on Zoom.
Right.
I guess, John, if one said, how on earth could we do it on Zoom with those that list of people, we'd say we'd have to rely upon an intermediary, which could be a child or a grandchild who could perhaps was within the bubble.
The problem is a lot of these people are self-isolating and they're not going to move, are they?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not trying to sort of, you know, be negative, but at the same time, I think you have to be realistic.
Yeah, I agree with John. I can't see it. All those people you've mentioned, John, I can't see us easily sitting down and using Zoom. I mean, and we all know each other quite well.
Yeah.
But I think I would find it with some of those people, it wouldn't be an easy and comfortable interview with two people on Zoom. Much better to be sitting face to face if we can manage that.
Okay.
Are the people that you've mentioned, would they be happy after the lockdown to be interviewed in person? Because I know some older people are very worried. You know, I mean,
all of them except one I dare say would be interviewed on a face-to-face.
Yeah.
They'd find that a lot more friendly and amenable.
right.
Something that they weren't used to at all. And they're the sort, I mean, we know those people for many years anyway. So I think it will be achievable.
Helen, you've got your hand raised.
So I was thinking that whilst some of these people are feeling a bit lonely, we could phone them up. And it doesn't have to be done in one phone call. It could be done over a series of short phone calls where we come back to it. And if the objective is to capture something that's going to go in the book, the key is to capture. I know it needs to be as it's said, but it's to capture that in writing. So if we wrote something down, you could then read it back to the person and say, well, this is what I've got so far, and then that would be sort of ready to go straight in the book.
Doing it on the phone is very difficult to record. So in such circumstances, it may rely on the person sort of making notes. I mean, in such an instance, it wouldn't be, I guess, a full transcription of everything that they say. That's the only thing. More than...
There's another thing, if I may. I spoke to Louise, well, I sent her an email earlier. If we're going to use some of these transcripts in the book and on our website, then we need pictorial support as well, because otherwise it's just going to be words which may well be interesting. But if you're doing it on a face-to-face, you get the spirit of the occasion and it starts to work, and hopefully it may be possible to get a photograph or two as well.
And I presume that what we're saying with this is that if we do record, by whatever means, whether it's on Zoom or whatever, we will have to transcribe the interviews in any case.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to come to that later. Yes, I mean, and transcription is another problem, because to provide a transcription is very labor intensive, and it's whether
Indeed,
people are
yeah.
prepared to do that, because you know, a minute of speech can take 5 minutes to type up. So an hour interview will be 5 hours of work for the interviewer or whoever is transcribing it.
I think there's a halfway house where you provide a kind of summary of all the main points, so that somebody can go back and listen to the recording and find the right place. That's a sort of stopgap. But there's also the problem of long-term storage. If we did something on a Zoom recording, what is the long-term storage? Can we transfer it to some other medium later on for long-term conservation?
Great. Have you got any?
Absolutely, and that's one of the major things, is the GDPR and the data protection legislation, which is a whole kind of
Minefield.
terms and addressed. Yeah.
Can I just say, you also get these transcribing programs?
Yes, if we have the budget to do that.
There are some free ones, but they can be a bit hit and miss.
Right.
David, you've got your hand up.
Yes, Google will do it for free. I use it quite a lot in terms of typing or talking into it, and it's amazingly accurate when I've played a recording back. And if I may make a second point whilst I'm talking, I'm doing a little bit of work on the Home Guard at the moment, and I have found people are quite happy to talk to me on the telephone, and they might say we can have a Zoom chat, but then they don't. So it doesn't happen. So somehow people, and these are older people again, and I'm fine one to talk, but they're happy to talk on the phone, but it makes it difficult to take the notes. And as somebody said earlier, recording seems to be difficult. And yet in my business life, we had a little thing that was on the side of our phones in the office, and we just flicked a switch and we could record. I don't know whether you can still buy those.
In all good spy shops, yes.
Well, it was a government organisation I was working for. Perhaps
When
it
it felt
had
was
to
it?
do with it.
Yeah, I'll go along to Chandler tomorrow and see if they can help us.
We can always wire you up, David.
Yeah.
What did people think about? I sent around a participation agreement and explanation. I mean, what did people think of that? Would older people be happy to sign that kind of agreement?
I think I think there's quite a lot in it, actually.
Yeah, I was going to say it's
Simpler one might be helpful.
Rather complicated.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of it is required under GDPR, as people need to give their informed consent, and that means that they have to be fully au fait with what we're all about, what we're going to do, and what we're asking of them.
that may be correct, but when I tick the box on my Apple telephone saying that I've read the terms and conditions, my nose gets a little bit longer, and in my opinion, no one will read that. They may sign it, but they very few people.
Perhaps there's a halfway house, which is we could have a sort of short form version on the front of the page, and then a full version that so we're not misrepresenting it, but the key things are on the front. Helen.
Or even more specifically, if what we're trying to get to is an extract that goes in the book, could we get someone to, just sign up to that extract, and that they're happy that is used in the book?
Or that we would validate it before we put it in the book or on the website.
Yeah.
Well,
looking
a participation agreement has to be signed before the interview. So the subject, the participant, needs to go into the interview being fully informed of what they've signed up for. And then there's another agreement that they have to sign subsequent to that, which is more about giving us permission, you know, what we're going to use the recording for. I mean, it's all on the Oral History Society website, and there's pages and pages of how you know, the necessity to be compliant. And I think as we are HLF funded, we really need to make sure that we do it properly.
I take your point, Louise, of what you've just said, but I mean, looking at the document again, I would have thought, I mean, I could edit that down into something which is half the size.
Okay.
So that whoever looked at it could see it, could read it very quickly, but it doesn't have the sort of the effect of looking at that and thinking, bloody hell, I've got to look at all of that then. One could make it a lot shorter and a lot more approachable.
Thank you, Ewan. John Chandler, you've got your hand up.
I was going to raise this anyway, but Louise has just mentioned the HLF. We are required, or we've said that we will do oral history as part of the HLF requirement, as it were. Were there stipulations as to how we were supposed to do it? I mean, for permanent preservation or anything like that? I just wondered whether we actually are having our wings clipped at all by what we've agreed to do.
I'll double check, but I'm pretty certain it was an open-ended thing. The one thing I'll just throw in to complicate matters is what I had been hoping we'd be able to do, this is pre-COVID, was somehow link this in with our educational program, which hasn't really got out the blocks yet, because I had this sort of nice idea that we'd be able to ship in a few older people into a school, get the kids to interview them. That way you get around all the sort of safeguarding type issues, and it's a nice day out for the people, and that, you know, the kids get to meet a real living piece of history. That's not going to work anytime soon, but it would be nice to see if we could think of a way of perhaps getting a classroom to interview, if we can. Where I'm getting to on this is I suspect we need to first of all list out everybody we think we'd like to talk to, and then sort of classify them between, you know, there may be a small number that are very Zoom literate and very up for it, and we could offer them as a subject to a class. There'll be some that with a little bit of coaxing could be a Zoomable. There'll be others that under no circumstances will be Zoomable. We either have an interim telephone conversation just to keep them going and keep, you know, be friendly and prepare for a face-to-face interview, and just be pragmatic and try and get half a dozen interviews done and regroup after that.
We tend to be thinking of the very elderly in much of this, but I suspect from Louise's point of view, somebody who's in their 40s or 50s who happens to have lived in Bremhill most of their life would be an interesting subject as well, wouldn't they? I mean, because we're bringing this history up to the present. So there may be a lot of middle-aged people who are very Zoom literate who might provide useful information.
Yeah, I agree. John. Yeah. I mean, I remember vividly my living in a small village in the 1970s, and that kind of input would be interesting for Bremhill. You know, I rode to school on my pony and stuff like that. Those kind of anecdotes would be really interesting, even from the late 20th century.
So is it possible that we could do the oral history part of this project in two phases? We could try and find people who we could do Zoom interviews with in the near future, you know, this side of Christmas, as it were. And then if the climate gets better after Christmas, we can try and tackle the more elderly and more computer literate people.
Just one basic question, which is worrying me a little bit. We're talking about interviewing people, and John's mentioned a range of people that came to mind. But what I was wondering is, what is it exactly we want to get out of this? What are we looking for? What you,
Yeah.
if you go and ask Nicol and talk to Nicol, what are you trying to get out of Nicol? Because what you get out of Nicol will be something very different from something you get out of, well, the category, John, you just talked about, Mark Kite, who has been in the village all his life, but is middle-aged. But what is it that we want? What is it we would be looking for? Because you can't sit down and do an interview unless you've got a range of questions that are beamed towards specific things that you want out of that interview.
Yeah. And that was on one of the handouts that, and John alluded to it, that list of questions that were posed in 1981, which sort of try and capture a portrait of rural life, which was quickly disappearing. And I did want to get people's input on what they would like to see in the book and whether those questions have any relevance. I mean, I know people find, you know, wartime histories really interesting, but, you know, are we going to be interviewing anyone with a recollection of World War II? So does that go into the questions? Yeah, so I really need to be guided by you on that.
Well, basically, you mentioned Nicol Jordan. Nicol, being the age he is, would comment on what it was like during the war years, being a vet. He, I know, had a monumental sized cart horse, because I got a picture of it. And the angle that I would have thought with him would have been the impact of movement on cattle now and that sort of thing, as far as the economy, what it was like socially with horse-drawn agricultural machinery and that sort of stuff. So I think it sort of impacts across not only the war years, but also all three of the angles, which is the economy and the social side of it.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right, John. I mean, it's trying to pick up some of the themes that we're going to be exploring in the other chapters, whether it's religion or the economy or social or cultural, and just get, you know, it's snapshots and little human interest stories.
One of the things which, sorry, I'm talking across you. One of the things which we said earlier, not tonight, but some time ago, was that this kind of snapshot of people making these sort of comments would sit perfectly at the end of each chapter. The sort of modern take on where the village is now.
Yeah,
I just thought that was brilliant, which is one of the reasons why I keep harping on about the fact that we need pictorial evidence as well to support it, because that would look fantastic in my view.
Okay. Any other comments and perspectives from around the group? Craig, what about a sort of any technical perspectives on how we might use the technology we've got to help this?
You're muted at the moment, Craig.
Yeah, hi, sorry, I've been listening in the background. I'm finishing my other work. Yeah, I mean, YouTube videos would probably I mean, John did send me an audio of Jim, and I'm working at trying to put that onto the videos that we did over the history weekend. It's possible that we can either, the best place to put that is probably going to be on YouTube, even though it isn't strictly speaking a video. We would just use a still image. It makes it easy to store. We don't have problems with bandwidth, and it's a good place for other people to find out about our projects. I don't really have much more to add. I've been following everything that you've said so far, and I kind of agree with the issues with regards to trying to interview people remotely. It's not going to be as productive or give us the results as would interviewing people in person.
Okay.
What's the time frame for doing this versus beginning to pull the book together?
Yeah, I need to deliver the book first draft really by the end of March next year. That's the timeline I'm working on. So to make use of these, I'm really going to need them in the next 2-3 months at the outside, really. It would be helpful to me if people were asked similar types of questions, so I get some consistency across the data set, as it were.
Yeah.
I mean, would it be helpful, as topics and subjects are so pertinent to this, if I draw up a list which I circulate for feedback in the next few days?
Yeah. Why don't you do that, Louise? That'd be great. And if we can all send in to each other names of people that we thought would be worth interviewing, and put a sort of 1, 2, 3 against that, whether sort of definitely Zoom to 3 definitely not Zoom, and then we can try and sort of prioritize so we can at least get something done in the next month or so. I mean, you know, even if it's just a phone call to make an appointment to see somebody in the new year, I think people would enjoy the interaction. I mean, one of the things I've found the trail and talking to people on the trail was people are fascinated by this stuff. They want to talk, they want to tell stories. They've all got their own perspectives, and we're just trying to find a way of doing that. The other practical thing, from the book's point of view, is people will buy a book if it's got their name in it. So you know, without wanting to have lists of everybody in the village, you know, it will definitely help sales if we've got 40, 30 people's names, and you know, it gives it a more personal feel.
Well, and that's quite important, because if we're aiming for 30 excerpts to go in the book, then each one's not going to be longer than a page, which makes this a more doable task. We're not trying to capture, you know, hours worth of transcript. You know, it's the really meaty bit.
Sound bites. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
I think it's really, I mean, the way I think about the output and back to the transcription problem. Yeah. We can do, if we do the interview properly, we record it properly, it's there on the website or wherever where we can store it for future work. But the person who did it will say there was a great quote about white witches. We get that bit, that goes into the book, and the rest we don't need to transcribe it at this point. But we're just getting some additional colour.
With the book in mind, I'll make a plea in that if you can ask the suitable candidates if they wouldn't mind being photographed, and make a note of that, rather than have them sign a sort of lease form at that stage, and then let me know. I will volunteer to actually take a professional photograph of the interviewee, so that they all have a sort of a commonality of approach, because there'd be nothing worse than somebody sending a passport photograph, a wedding photograph, you know, and it's all going to be a mishmash. I'm particularly keen that we do record the visual aspect of this as well. Yeah. So I'd offer to do that. So is that something everybody could agree to?
Yeah. When I started this, I did Rex Grimshaw several years ago. He's since deceased. And I took his photograph outside his cottage, which has since been sold and modernised. So I've got a picture of him against the original, in the front sort of porch of the original cottage, which is, I mean, that might be a kind of consistent way of doing it. Pictures in front of people's houses, if relevant.
I think having a whole bunch of pictures would be brilliant, because we, you know, even if we don't, not everybody gets a quote in the book, we could do a montage on a back page or something on Faces of Bremhill. You know, it would, again, people would like you to buy a book with that picture in it.
Yeah, certainly. Are we looking at arrange. I mean, we've talked an awful lot about interviewing people who are elderly, who are getting on. I mean, we talked about the war. Well, I don't know, I was only 8 at the end of the war. So there aren't very many of us around who've got many memories of that. Is it just as, which I think John Harris said, is a sort of mentioned just about every elderly person in the area that I know. I don't know anybody else. So thanks for that, John. You've taken everyone away that I was going to think about.
Well, I can think of a few more as well, but I think the main thing is if Louise actually covers the points in the chapter that she wants a comment on, we can then match the people to those comments.
But what I was going to say is it just as acceptable? I think John Chandler, you mentioned this, that there are other people who've been in the village, just not Bremhill, but the parish, for 30 or 40 years.
Yes, I think so, yes.
Is what they are going to say just as valid?
Yes, I'm sure it is. I mean, the trouble is, I expect that a lot of the elderly people who live in the parish don't actually come from Bremhill. They've moved here, so their early life is not, might be of interest, but it's not of interest to this project. Whereas some middle-aged people will have been brought up here, and if we can find them and talk to them, they will have just as much useful information.
Or indeed in Bremhill village itself, there's a lot of people, if I think of the houses up and down the street, who've come into Bremhill at their age of about 30 or 40 and have lived here for 30 years. So they've not been all their lives here, but they've sort of...
That I gave you originally have lived in the parish all their lives.
I mean, I don't think we're trying to be exclusive or ageist in this. If anybody, if anybody that we think's got a story to tell, frankly, I mean, if they were 40 now and moved here 10 years ago, they'd have something interesting to say potentially. But let's prioritise the older ones because we don't want them falling off their perches before we finish the project.
Thank you. That's very kind of you.
Well, David, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I think it's actually important about growing up in the area, even if people aren't that old, because the perspective that you remember back as your childhood growing up in this area is important. So, I'm in Stanley, so I'm thinking about the Toucher girls. They've lived here all their lives and they've grown up on a farm in the area and they've seen enormous changes. I mean, the way they were milking was hand milking when I first came to this area, and they will remember that. They grew up here. And Verena Vanzelotti, she grew up in the Titherton Stanley area. So I think their memories are going to be really important, even though it wasn't perhaps that far back, but the changes have been so immense in that time that I think we should.
I agree completely. I'd really love to hear those kind of perspectives, charting, even at the end of the 20th century, how things changed.
Yeah, enormous changes.
Yeah.
Louise, when you circulate your document with the themes on it, perhaps if you can stratify, put the sort of headings to prompt people to fill in who they think we should speak and whether they think they do a Zoom, and perhaps some sort of way of saying I think they'd be really interested to talk about changes in farming practice or changes in religious observance or whatever it might be.
Yeah, brilliant.
David.
Yes, many of you know I did a video on Bremhill Video Year, which involved me going to all the events in 1 year. As part of that, I've got interviews with people like Nicole and interviews with people like Jim Scott growing up in Stanley. I've got 40 or 50 hours of video. I don't know how best I can use that. The actual video I produced was only an hour and a half, but I've got the backup of about 40 or more hours. So what do I do with it?
It's called a lockdown box set that somebody's going to
give it to Louise, I think. Yeah.
Tom, you've it's good to know about that, David. And no simple answer to that.
For instance, I've got Jim Scott here, and I'm looking at it now, and he talks for an hour, growing up in Stanley up until he was 9 years of age. The next version was going to be living in Wick Hill when he moved to Wick Hill, and I did this 4 years ago now, so it's a very young Jim Scott.
Wow, I'd love to see that.
Okay.
Well, how do I share a screen? You can see 2 minutes of it now if you want to be bored. Just
Tom, were
to
you
see
going to
how
say
it went.
I was just going to mention Ron and Audrey, who live around on the corner of the Bend in our village, East Titherton. They're brother and sister, and they have lived in the village all their life. They sort of immediately stand out as people that perhaps should be interviewed, but you know, they are of a certain age, and Zoom definitely will be a no-no, I'm quite sure, with them.
Okay, but we can put them down for hopefully a distanced face-to-face in due course, if they're willing. I mean, you know, we want to make this a positive and enjoyable experience for everybody. John, I had one final question for you, just going back to the original part of your talk. You know, is there any advice on how to handle people if they get emotional? Because, you know, memories of brothers lost in the war, or you know, deceased parents or whatever might just you know, you don't, I don't know. Have you had experience?
Not really. The lady I interviewed a couple of weeks ago, who, as I say, has got dementia, she got very frustrated at one point. She couldn't remember things, and I've seen her in other contexts getting very sort of weepy. One thing that Paul Thompson's book says is if you're trying to get information on a sort of sensitive area, don't ask direct questions, but sort of allude to something, so that if the interviewee wants to tell you, they can do so, but you're not confronting them with a difficult question. But of course, that's a skill, isn't it? And it's sort of tact as much as anything. But in answer to your question, is I don't know whether you should have a box of tissues next to you, or what you're supposed to do. Sorry.
Any other questions or comments? It's been really, John Harris.
Yeah, just to mention the fact that when I said Mark Kite, of course, it was his mother and father, Derek Kite, who was the verger, and Nancy Kite, also a devout churchgoer, but she was a lace maker. Now, when I spoke to Mark, he said, well, I know all about that because I've lived with them up until the age of 30 anyway. So he knew all the aspects of his family and covered those points. So even though he's not elderly, he could still make sensible comments about some of the things that his mother and father did.
Yeah. With John's proviso that because it's a second-hand experience, it's probably even less reliable as a true historical source. But you know, we're just trying to add colour to this rather than
I think
earth-shattering.
that's the other thing. Is that's the point about photography on the subjects here and everything else, is we're adding colour to the story as well as the factual information.
Okay.
See, Mark actually lived in a flat in the vicarage when he was younger.
That's correct.
So thank you, John and Louise, for that thought-provoking series of talks. If I could ask everybody to think about people that we should be interviewing, and then once we'll try and hone that into a list and then circulate it and try and divide the tasks up so it's not onerous for any one person. You know, it would be, if everybody could commit to doing 2 or 3, then we'd have a fantastic start on this. Just back to my point about education, if anybody has got any ideas about how we can either link this to education or to give the educational program a kickstart, please drop me a line separately, because it's something we're struggling with at the moment. It's the one area where, as I come to write the update for the next tranche of money off the National Lottery Heritage Fund, I'm slightly not sure what I'm going to say, but so don't want any answers now, but if anybody's got educational expertise or contacts, please let me know.
And I'll push an email around later this evening to everyone on Sarah's list that was invited to this, which will basically give you all those links. Don't forget this thing about Malmesbury next Wednesday, if you're interested. Yeah, fine. Thank you very much.
All right. I hope you feel better soon, Louise.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Louise, could I just have a word before you go when the others have signed off, please?
Sure.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 John Harris, I think I'm going to have to remain on it as well, or because I'm the host.
Problem. I'm only going to take a minute anyway.
Okay.
Louise, where are we with the draft chapters? Because the only one I've got at the moment is the draft of the social history chapter.
I've got.
And I've been matching